The source for what I'm going to teach you today comes from Edith Hamilton's mythology. It's a book that I read when I was in 8th and ninth grade, and it just sort of, in a very simple, straightforward way, tells the stories of the Greek and Roman gods, their stories, their myths, and gives sort of descriptions of all the different characters of that world. We're interested in the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, and you need to know this before you read the dramatic monologue Eurydice by H.D. So, the story of Orpheus and Eurydice comes to us from Virgil and Ovid, and I'm sort of using Edith Hamilton as my Wikipedia to give you what I think you need to know. Hamilton teaches us that the very earliest musicians were the gods. She reminds us that Athena created the flute, and that Hermes made the lyre and gave it to Apollo. She reminds us that Hermes also made the shepherd's pipe. It's sort of like, it looks like somebody playing two pipes at the same time. And Pan made the pipe of reeds. And more importantly, almost than the instruments, are the muses themselves. And the muses, of course, are the gods of music. It's where we get the word music, in fact. Now, the gods, of course, are the gods, but then she goes on to talk about who among the mortals are the greatest musicians. And by far the greatest of them all is Orpheus. He is a mortal, but he's the son of a muse and a mortal. But there was something divine about his music, and it had a power to capture the hearts and emotions of anybody who heard it. Not just anybody, but nature itself seems to almost swoon to the way he plays his music. Hamilton writes it like this: everything animate and inanimate followed him. He moved the rocks on the hillside and turned the course of the rivers. That's the power of his music. Jason was one of the Argonauts. Orpheus was one of the Argonauts who traveled with Jason, in search of the Golden Fleece and all that. And it's clear from those stories that Orpheus saved them from, the sirens, and he would play his lyre, and that would sort of soothe the men and settle disputes. And so, obviously, Jason couldn't have been the great hero that he was were he not for Orpheus and his contributions to that. So, Orpheus falls in love with and marries Eurydice. But the way the story goes is, when you have to remember, no woman could ever resist Orpheus's music, his song, so he can marry whoever he wants. But he chooses Eurydice, and they get married, and this is how Hamilton writes it, directly after the wedding, as the bride walked into a meadow with her bridesmaids, a viper stung her, and she died. Orpheus's grief was overwhelming. He could not endure it. He determined to go down to the world of death and bring Eurydice back, he said to himself. You can skip over most of the adventures, but Orpheus, he goes down into the underworld, Hades, and he meets a lot of people, like, he meets that three-headed dog, and he meets the Wheel of Fortune, and he meets Sisyphus, he meets Tantalus, he meets the Furies. But finally, he comes to Hades himself and Hades' queen, and he sings for them. And he reminds Hades, or in Latin, Pluto, about his own love of Persephone, and how, the loss of Persephone meant the loss of eternal springtime. And the song moves Pluto. It says, and this is a quote from Ovid, He drew iron tears down Pluto's cheek, and he made hell grant the love he did seek. Pluto makes a deal with Orpheus, and he says that he can take Eurydice out of the underworld. He gives him a path, and he makes one condition. The one condition is you can't look back. Once you leave, you can make this journey out of the underworld, but you can't look back at Eurydice until you've completely emerged from this cave. This reminds me of the story of Lot taking his wife out of Gomorrah. Lot turns back. His wife turns into a pillar of salt. In Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus looks back at her before they've emerged from the cave. And so you have this image of him escaping, but her being drawn back into the underworld. Well, the gods don't give second chances, and so they wouldn't let Orpheus go back into the underworld a second time while he was still alive. Orpheus took this rather harshly, and he decided to console himself by never spending any time with men ever again. He abjures the sight of men